Welcome to Inner Peace with Dr. Reese, a program that can help you become liberated in the modern world. Now, here's your host, Dr. Kevin W. Reese.
So, is there mysticism in the Christian tradition? Welcome to episode number 81. Today, I'm happy to talk to Carl McColman. He's the author of the Big Book of Christian Mysticism, as well as Answering the Contemplative Call. In this very in-depth conversation, we will discuss an encounter he had with the Devine at only 16 years old. We'll talk about what contemplative prayer is, his mentorship with the Trappist Monks, how the death of his daughter affected his faith, and of course we will dive into the Christian tradition and talk Jesus the Christ, Paul, Judas, the Last Supper, and much more. Throughout the conversation, you'll be introduced to many of the Christian mystics throughout the eras, including perhaps the most prolific of them all. So sit back, relax, and take in this beautiful recording. Carl, welcome to the Inner Peace podcast.
Oh, it's good to be here.
On this podcast, we talk about mysticism all the time. A lot of people in this world do not know what a mystic is. How would you describe a Christian mystic or Christian mysticism?
Well, I appreciate the way you asked the question because I do think that mystics come in different flavors. And we can certainly talk about mysticism in a universal sense. That's certainly a conversation that's good to have. My wheelhouse is the mystical tradition within Christianity. So I'll reply to your answer as you ask the question using some language and some, perspectives that may be specific to Christianity that other traditions may or may not share.
Right.
Or they may have similar perspectives but use different language. It's a lot of fun exploring this world.
Yes.
Christianity, of course, is a theistic tradition, as in contrast to, say, Buddhism, where belief in God is not really that important to the wisdom tradition, but Christianity is very much built on belief in God. How do you define God? I think the best definition that's found in the New Testament is God is love. I like to say love with a capital L. Love that is conscious love, sentient love, love that has a face, love that when you gaze into that love gazes back. It's a love that knows and that is aware. So Evelyn Underhill, who was a wonderful Christian mystic that lived a century ago, early 20th century, she defined mysticism as the art of union with reality. So I would build on her definition, and I would say it's the art of union with love with a capital L.
I like that because reality is something the average person doesn't exactly have a full grip on because they're caught in their mind.
I think there's some truth there, and we can certainly talk about what is the relationship between reality with a capital R, and in the Underhill definition, it is with a capital R, and love with a capital L. And I would argue that there is, almost identical coherence there.
Yeah.
Maybe they're two different doorways into the same inner sanctum, but that's at any rate, that's where I come into this conversation is, wanting a taste, maybe by the grace of God or of love, having had a taste of that infinite love, and then being thirsty for more, and desiring to experience and express that love, not only in my own body, but also in my relationships and how I encounter other
If you've had it, if you've had a taste, then that would mean by definition you're a mystic.
I'm a little diffident when it comes to calling myself a mystic.
It's a label, understood.
Yeah, but I have no problem with the label. I think that let's put it this way: I would hope that we are all Well, let me be even stronger than that. I believe we are all mystics. There is several authors have said this. I don't know who said it first, but this idea that the mystic is not a special kind of person. Each person is a special kind of mystic.
Mm.
And so I like to approach the question of what does it mean to be a mystic? What does it mean to embrace the mystical life from that perspective, that there is no one right answer. That, that part of being a mystic is being your true self. That's a term you hear a lot. And I quibble with the concept of the false self, but the true self, I think, is a pretty healthy concept. And this idea that there's a deep authenticity. There is, there's an imprint within us, within our DNA, if you will, a blueprint that comes out of that divine love. And part of the mystical journey is this journey of coherence with who we truly are. Mm. And you mentioned, many people aren't in touch with the reality. Well, I would argue that begins with your own interior reality. Mm. That if we don't know who we truly are, then that's going to throw, the entire picture out of focus. And our ability to be in relationship with the environment, with other people, with God, with all things, gets compromised by that fundamental inability to be in relationship with ourselves. So, so a big piece of this, I think, is learning who we truly are. Right. And again, using Christian language, who we have been created to be. What does it mean if I say God is love, and then I say we are created in the image and likeness of God? Then that means we are created in the image and likeness of love. And so, the question, the purgative way, the way of purification, is learning to let go of all that within me that is not love.
Christianity, New Age Christianity, at least, let's just call it the last 150 years or so, 200 years, it's very, very much based on faith, that belief, but mysticism is a little bit more direct experience.
Yeah, and I think that we misunderstand both faith and belief and experience. So there are issues with each of these categories. A Christianity within, I would say, not just the last 100 years, the last maybe 500 to 600 years, has been trammeled by this obsession with belief, with thinking the right thoughts. And that if you aren't thinking the right thoughts, then somehow there's something wrong with you. You're a heretic, you're unorthodox, you're heterodox, these kinds of labels that are very, very toxic. Faith, I share with you kind of this concern about belief and being obsessed with belief. Faith, I'm not as worried about, because I think faith ties in with trust. It ties in with presence,
confidence.
Confidence means with faith, fidelity. I'm old enough that I remember, high fidelity recordings. Nowadays we have Wi-Fi, which I don't know what the Y stands for, but it's a pun on hi-fi. When I was a kid, high fidelity, a recording, the Beatles or the Rolling Stones or whatever, that was faithful to the original music. So, faithfulness is again, I think, authenticity. I'm created in the image and likeness of love. Am I faithful to that creation? That's what it means to have faith. It means to be faithful to love, to trust love, to orient my life to love, to calibrate myself to love. But this idea that faith means I'm going to tick off a bunch of boxes. Do you believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth? Check. Do you believe in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord? Check. Of course, we're cognitive beings. There's nothing wrong with mind. I think what maybe, my sense of maybe where you're coming from, and I would certainly say this, is that I think mind has tended to colonize heart and body in our tradition, at least in the Christian tradition, but not just in Christianity. You see it in other places too. And so part of what we need to do is we need to get back to that point where maybe the heart is leading the mind, rather than the other way around. And if we can live that way, then this idea that, okay, it's good to have kind of working hypotheses about the universe. And that's where I think this kind of belief comes in. That believing that the universe is safe, even when horrible things are happening. That takes a bit of a leap. But I think when we're letting the heart lead, it's not as, I don't want to use the word dramatic. It's not as incredible of a leap. It's more of an intuitive leap. It's like, yes, I know I'm created in the image and likeness of love, and that's my center. My center is not whether good things are happening to me or bad things are happening to me. Because the reality is that we live in a universe that's mutable. Suffering is real. Every sacred tradition. I mean, the Buddha leads with that. Suffering is real. Now, we can talk about, is suffering an illusion, or how do we create suffering? How do we heal suffering? I think all of those are really valid conversations to have. But even if you think, I have many friends in the unity tradition, a Christian tradition, that's very much built on affirmation. Well, why are affirmations so important? Because suffering is real, because people experience suffering. And so we are looking for strategies to either minimize or eliminate or transform or transmute that. So that's the reality. Faith is this way of saying, what is it in the Bible? Even if God were to kill me, still I would praise God. Now that's a radical statement, and I'm not necessarily promoting that for anyone. But that even in the midst of profound suffering, I can be anchored in love. I can make my choices out of love. I can go to bed at night knowing I'm safe and the people I love are safe. I had one child, and that child passed away a little over 6 years ago. And that's the most painful thing I've ever experienced.
Sure.
And it's funny because I was at the gym a year or two after Rhiannon died, and I was just striking up a conversation with somebody at the gym. Never met the guy before. We were just kind of chatting, and I don't know. We got on the subject of spirituality and faith, and he told me he was a nurse, and I said, I have such respect for nurses because they were truly incredible companions for us when our daughter was sick and she died. And of course, he was moved by that. We just met 5 minutes ago. And he says, "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear about your daughter." And I said, "Thank you." And he said, "I'm a person of faith." There's that word. He said, "Do you consider yourself a person of faith?" And I said, "Well, yeah." And he said, "How did the experience of your daughter's death impact your faith?" Now, this guy was a church-going Christian, very, to the best of my knowledge, I've never seen him ever, 5 years later. I haven't seen him ever since. To the best of my knowledge, what we would think of as your typical Sunday morning, Bible-believing, kind of a Christian, may have never heard the word mystic in his life.
Right.
But obviously his church was important to him. So he asks me this question. And I had to think about it for a second. And I said to him, because I entered into my daughter's suffering with faith, not that belief thing, but that embodied faith, that heart-centered sense that everything is safe. As Julian of Norwich says, all shall be well, great Christian mystic. I entered into her suffering with that I was available to be present with her, to work to alleviate her suffering, to hold her, to laugh with her, to just walk the journey. And I would say at the end of it, my faith has been deeply, deeply strengthened, that I am a person of deeper faith. And then I said to him, and it's interesting in the light of this conversation you and I are having, because I said, and I could see where somebody who didn't come into it with an already deep faith, that an experience like that could break their faith. And what I think I was intuitively picking up on was the distinction that you and I have been talking about. If your faith is just about believing in the right words, that's a brittle faith. That can be easily destroyed. And I think we're seeing it in this day and age where especially so many young people are looking at the shadow side of Christianity and they're saying, "No, thank you. I'm not interested." I'm not interested in a religion that's going to shame me because I'm gay or because my friends are gay. I'm not interested in a religion that's afraid of the feminine. I'm not interested in a religion that thinks it's the only way and everybody else is somehow not good enough for God. So it's like this whole generation of young people are suddenly, they're coming at it from this hard perspective, and they're saying that intellectual stuff, it doesn't work anymore. Maybe it worked 100 years ago in grandma's day when Christians lived in little insular communities, but we live in the global village. If you're going to tell me the Christian story, then we also need to talk about the Buddhist story, or the story of Muhammad, or the story of Moses, or the story of White Buffalo Calf Woman, all the way down
Krishna,
the pipe. Krishna,
Jalaluddin Rumi.
Exactly, and that, so now we the Jesus story has to be told and entered into in the light of all these other stories. And I don't want to say competing stories, because I think in the level of spirit, there is no competition. But on the level of dogma, there is. So it's like you have to get out of that head, that belief place, into that faith heart place.
Yeah, Christians tend to be really, again, wrapped in the belief of Jesus, Son of God, and that's it. And they don't want to hear about Buddha or whoever else.
Can we say some Christians are like that? Because not all are. But you're right. That is widespread, especially in the institutional church.
Right. Yeah. The evangelical,
Catholic too. It's across the board.
Right. And so from your experience, from your viewpoint, from your studies, is Jesus the Christ, the Son of God, or was he a great mystic with an unbelievably beautiful message?
Why does that have to be either or? I have no problem with Jesus being the Son of God. Where I think we get into trouble is this idea that Jesus has something that no one else has.
Right.
Right. And even, mystical Christianity has an escape hatch to that way of thinking. That way of thinking, obviously, this is church history that's kind of, beyond the scopes of a podcast. But, there were a lot of political and philosophical reasons why the early church established those dogmas. They were trying to build a sense of identity. Any community does that. That's part of the nature of community, is you build a sense of identity. The problem becomes, is your sense of identity built on a center, or is it built on a circumference? In other words, do you have a center from which you can relate to everybody? God is love. I am created in the image and likeness of love. Or is your identity built on a circumference, which is like a fortress that's designed to keep some people out and others in, and then it ends up functioning like a prison. And I think mystical Christianity, and again, I'm oversimplifying here, but mystical Christianity invites us back into that place of living out of the center, whereas institutional Christianity far too much has been all about the circumference, all about the fortress, i.e. prison. And so, so to say Jesus is the Son of God, Jesus himself said, the Father and I are one. That was blasphemy in the Jewish world. And, Jesus was Jewish, and he was an observant Jew. He was a practicing Jew. Right. But he makes this deeply mystical statement, and the community that hears this, they pick up stones to start stoning him. And he's like, what's the deal here? So he had great courage to step outside of the orthodoxies of his day.
Tremendous courage.
So, but then what does that mean? Does that mean, well, Jesus gets to be one with God, but you and I are out of luck? Jesus never said that. No. But what you find emerging within, again, the mystical dimension of Christianity is this idea that we are all Christ. We are all the body of Christ. Mm-hmm. We all have the mind of Christ. I'm quoting the New Testament here. This is not some far out, this is right in the sacred writings, but it's sacred writings that have tended to be passed over in favor of other texts also found in the Bible that enforce more of that boundaried approach. So, so one of the things I think the mystics have been doing for 2,000 years has been saying, this is not about building walls. This is about building bridges. This is about building relationships. If God is love and I am one with God, which means I am one with love, I'm in the image and likeness of love. My job is to be love. My job is to love. And once you start living in that place, then suddenly the concept of boundaries and institutions just kind of recedes into the background. People ask me, why do you stay in the institution? And I'm like, well, from my perspective, it doesn't really make that big of a difference whether you're in the institution or not.
Right. You can still go to church and.
Yeah. I'm of service in the institution. I mean, a big part of what I do is, I serve people who are Christians who are afraid they are not one with God. And I try to help them to see how the tradition itself teaches this.
Right.
And so it's does that mean I have to put up with the shadow side of the institution? You bet. When people outside the institution start complaining about the institution, I always laugh because I'm like, oh, it's a lot worse on the inside.
Right.
Right. I can tell you stories that'll make your fingers curl. But the question becomes, it's like if you have a commitment to end world hunger, where are you going to go? You're going to go into places where people are hungry. So if you have a commitment to bring love to the world, you need to go to the places where people feel separated from love. And I hate to say it, but the institutional church is one of the biggest places where people feel separated from love. So I feel like, if you're serious about mystical Christianity, I'm not saying everyone should be a member of the institution. It's funny, if you read my blog or my books, I always say we need to be in community, but I don't say we need to be in the institution.
Right.
Because for some people, the institution has hurt people. And sometimes you have to be outside the institution. I mean, if you're a queer person, for example, or even, many women, people who've been abused by a priest or a minister, there are many good reasons not to be in the institution. But if you can be in the institution and be of service, why not?
Do you ever get pushback from the Christian institution, being that you're diving deeper into the teachings from a mystical perspective?
I'm very blessed in that I'm part of a community, a church community, and a community of retreat centers and monasteries where the people that I work with pretty much get what I'm trying to do. And, and the ones that are threatened by what I do, they just they don't invite me to come speak. So, there's no big deal. The biggest challenge I get is usually from individuals, and it's usually online. People will find my website and then they'll leave a comment about how I'm promoting the devil, or what I'm promoting Buddhism, like that's a bad thing. I'm like, hey, maybe you need more Buddhism. Let me give you a book list.
Right.
But I think every Christian could stand to learn a little bit of the
who was more peaceful than Gautama the Buddha, right?
No. So yeah, the pushback for me tends to come less from the institution and more from individuals who find my work threatening. And the reality is I'm a small potato out there. So I'm not big enough for most churches to even consider as a threat, and the churches that I do work with, or the monasteries or retreat centers, again, they are pretty much committed to the same kind of work I'm doing, cultivating a healthy spirituality. Since you're interested in mysticism, you may know Karl Rahner, the German theologian, said the Christian of the future will be a mystic or will not exist. Isn't that a profound statement? The Christian of the future will be a mystic or will not exist. And I tell people, I'm just this guy in Atlanta. I'm not attached to a foundation or a university or anything like that, who's just trying to take Rahner seriously and trying to help more and more Christians who love Jesus and love the Christian culture. Let's be mystics. Let's make Christianity a mystical tradition, which I believe it is meant to be. Let's recapture what has been lost.
I mean, it's all there in the Sermon on the Mount.
The Sermon on the Mount, even the writings of Paul. A lot of people think, Paul was homophobic and Paul was sexist. Paul has a shadow. We have to just acknowledge that. But Paul also was a mystic. I mean, Paul talks about being caught up into was it the third or the seventh? I can never remember, but the third heaven, I think it was. He has these, he encounters Christ on the road to Damascus. So, so Paul, when Paul is high functioning, it's gold. The problem is Paul is he's a mess, like most of us are. And when he's having a bad day, he says some pretty unfortunate things. So
yeah,
and have to sort through that.
And it's important to know that there are, I'm going to use the word levels, or you said earlier, there's
dimensions,
different flavors of mystics.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So somebody could be a beginner versus someone who is so advanced that they're just, they become a guru or something.
And you see this among the Christian mystics. I teach the Christian mystics, and I always tell people, you are not obligated to believe everything the mystics say. Let the mystics be human. Let them make mistakes. Let them have a shadow side. But be discerning, because they all have something amazing to say too. So we have to, we have to show up. We have to bring our own authenticity. There's that authenticity again. Read the mystics, let it resonate, heart speak to heart. And it's like, yeah, okay, Paul's telling women they need to submit. Paul's having a bad day here. Okay, that doesn't mean Paul is evil and we should ignore everything Paul says. But it also doesn't mean we have to believe that just because Paul said it. It's that kind of discerning mind. And then when Paul starts talking about the fruit of the Spirit, love is patient, love is kind, those kinds of, it's like, okay, now we're onto something. And you can bring that same principle of discernment to all the mystics. And I would argue all the mystics of all wisdom traditions. I'm sure the Buddha had bad days too.
I mean, what's more mystical than the kingdom of heaven is within you?
And what's interesting about that is that if you go back to the Greek, the word that gets translated as within can also be translated as among. And you'll find some Bible versions, you're quoting the King James, kind of, the gold standard, at least in the Protestant world. But some Bible versions will translate it that other way. And I've had people say, well, which is right, within or among? I'm like, trust the Greek. They both are right. That means we find God in our heart. The kingdom is within you. But we also find God in relationships. The kingdom is among you. And that in relationship, in community, in people loving and caring for one another, and supporting one another and helping one another to heal and be healthy and grow, that's where the kingdom of God is found. And then especially when you start bringing that into people who are suffering, and this is, you see this with Jesus. He clearly said, I was hungry and you fed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was in prison and you visited me. It's like, well, when did we do that? And he's like, when you did it to any of these, and he says, these who are my brothers, gendered language, my brothers and sisters. And he wasn't just talking about Christians. He was talking about humanity. We're all brothers and sisters of the Christ, of the anointed one, the Messiah. And so whenever we love another person, what are we doing? We're giving them God, and when they love us and we receive that love, and I'm not just talking about happy feelings. I'm all for happy feelings. But I'm talking about concrete, physical. This is why Jesus washed people's feet. It doesn't get more down to earth than that.
No.
Christian mysticism is profoundly earthy. It's sensual.
Yes.
And we get caught up. You mentioned, getting stuck in your head, getting caught up in kind of abstractions. That's again the problem with dogma and belief. It tends to become disincarnated, and the whole idea of, Jesus being the Son of God or one with God, it's the idea of the fullness of the divine is incarnated, it's infleshed, it's here embodied. And again, it's not just Jesus, it's all of us. So.
Yeah. And, Judas sort of represents the doubters, right? Because wasn't there a moment when Jesus was getting his feet washed and Judas is like, you're supposed to be this earthly master. How can you do that? And these are the little seeds that get planted in a doubter's mind. And it eventually builds to, a culminating betrayal.
An act of aggression. Yeah. And again, one of the things is we can read all of these stories in a very archetypal way. So when you read a story like the New Testament, the gospel, you read it archetypally, that means who's the Christ in me? Who's the Judas in me? Who's the Peter in me? Who's the Paul in me? Who's the Mary Magdalene? Who's the the Elizabeth or Mary or any of those figures? We carry all of those in our own heart. And so I know I have the Judas energy in me. I have that, like you say, the energy that doubts, the energy that's cynical, the energy that looks for bad motives. I mean, we see it on display, having just finished this incredibly contentious political campaign here in America, where both sides have been so quick to demonize the other side. But we've got to get over this idea that the other side is demonic. Maybe the other side is mistaken. Maybe the other side has a lot of work to do. I grant you all of that.
And it should be like that with religion as well.
Oh, exactly. Because once we strip the person who is our opponent, once we strip them of their humanity, we are making ourselves vulnerable for being aggressive, for hostility and aggression, and then the Judas spirit has won, and so we have to continually. We have to recognize that Judas energy in us, but then bring to that the Christ energy, the Peter energy, Peter who makes mistakes, who gets things wrong, who denies Jesus 3 times. But then what does he do? He seeks to restore the relationship. He cleans up his own mess. He says, I'm sorry. A lot of people miss this, but Peter denies Jesus 3 times. And then when the next time Jesus sees Peter after the resurrection, so Jesus, and I love to think he just has this luminous body shimmering with light. And what does Jesus do? He just says to Peter, do you love me? And he asks him the question 3 times. Well, he didn't need to ask him 3 times, but it's like he was mystically unwinding the denials. He was saying, okay, you denied me 3 times. Just celebrate your love for me 3 times. Let's restore what was broken. So we all have that in us. I've been married, 27 and a half years now, and I can tell you, I have not always been the best husband in 27 and a half years. I've lost my temper. Just at any rate, you don't need to go into all my shadow stuff. But what is the nature of a healthy marriage? It's not that you never fight, but that you mend the fences when there's been a disruption. You reconcile, you come back together, you strengthen the bond. That's what makes a marriage healthy. And I think it's the same thing with any relationship. So we all carry that within us, the capacity to destroy or the capacity to restore, to reconcile, to heal. And, so again, what is Christian mysticism? Christian mysticism is this idea, God is love, I am one with love. And out of that oneness with love, I can always choose to make the next step be the loving step, even if I'm in the middle of a mess, even if I'm in the middle of a mess of my own doing, even if I'm in the middle of somebody else's mess, I can always make the loving choice.
How would you describe the mystical version of the Last Supper?
Well, again, I have no problem with the doctrine of the real presence. It's the very beginning of my new book. They'll be coming out next summer. Okay, I begin by quoting Saint Benedict, who was the founder of Western monasticism. Saint Benedict says, we believe the divine presence is everywhere. Saint Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. These are all mystics, okay? Saint Ignatius of Loyola, you need to learn to find God in all things. Julian of Norwich, that wonderful mystic, despite her name, she's a woman, this amazing woman mystic in the 14th century. She says the fullness of joy is to behold God in all. Again and again, Teilhard de Chardin, there are so many of these great mystics who just keep saying this. And then I start quoting scripture verses to back this up. And I even quote 1 or 2 from the Quran to show it's not just a Christian thing. It's a global thing. Part of mystical teaching is that we find the divine presence everywhere. Well, if the real presence is everywhere, why wouldn't it be in the bread and the wine? It's like it's the easiest thing. Of course, the bread and the wine is the body and blood of Christ. And when I feast on that body and blood, I am feasting on the love that is in my heart. I am being nurtured by the nutrients that make me who I truly am. Now, you can say, what, can't you just get that from, having a bagel and a glass of orange juice? Well, of course you can. But the ritual, the story, the sacred story that Jesus gave us through the Last Supper, that story reminds us who we are. And so that's why it's important for us to keep telling that story. And for those of us who believe, that it's like, yes, look, I use that word believe. I should say those of us who have faith. But that we remember this sacred story. That's what Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me. So I'm in relationship with Jesus. Somebody who isn't in relationship with Jesus, communion's not going to mean anything to them. And that's okay. That doesn't change how much God loves them. It doesn't change my obligation to be love to them as well. I mean, this is nothing. Christians really get hung up on who's in and who's out. That's that boundary thing again. Mm. But I don't think that's what Jesus was all about. Jesus was all about, here is love, infinite, vast love. Here it is. You can have it all. Now give it away. That's the gospel in a nutshell.
I also, from my viewpoint, take it as him talking about the deep relationship between master and disciple. Drink me in, eat me, take, there's a lot of Christians don't understand this because they never looked into the Eastern traditions where master disciple is a really big to-do.
Well, you take Shaktipat, for example, this idea that the master transmits to the disciple.
Right.
I think that is very much something that it happens in the Christian world, but I think it tends to happen by accident because we don't have a culture to support it. And so, when I think of the monks that I've studied with, that I've worked with, that I've prayed with, who have mentored me over the years, they have been profound in terms of shaping who I am. Now, is that Shaktipat in the same sense that you might get from a guru? Well, I don't know. I've never experienced that, so it's hard to say. But certainly, I would say in a very, subtle way, that I am a different person than I was 15 years ago when I first started studying with the Trappists. That difference is not just I learned a bunch of things out of books. That's back to the dogma level. Again, nothing wrong with books, nothing wrong with stories, nothing wrong with teachings. But what really matters is that heart-to-heart thing. And that's where I think Shaktipat happens. That's where transmission happens. And the monks will tell you, they say, if you want to be a monk, come live with us. We can't teach you how to be a monk. Just come live with us. Do it for a couple of years. And then you'll know whether you're a monk or not. I mean, and they're so laid back. The people will do it for a couple of years, and then they'll say, it's time for me to go. And they'll say, we love you. Have a good life. And others will say, I want to stay. And they'll say, great, we'll have a profession ceremony. You get to wear, and that's the reality. But you're right. It's this body to body, heart to heart. We learn it by living it. So.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite people to study is Meister Eckhart.
All right. Yeah.
How important would you say Meister Eckhart is to Christian mysticism?
He is, in terms of the teaching, he's absolutely one of the 5 must-know mystics. In terms, I would say the only ones that I would put on a par with him, probably Teilhard de Chardin, certainly John of the Cross, maybe the Cloud of Unknowing. But the Cloud of Unknowing is so narrow. Meister Eckhart, I mean, we've got 100 of his sermons. We've got so much literature of his. A couple of people in the East as well. But there are very few that had that kind of purity of vision and the ability to articulate it so beautifully. What is the most brilliant quote of Eckhart's from his 16th sermon? The eye with which I see God is the eye with which God sees me. Mm-hmm. God's eye and my eye are one eye, one knowing, one will, and one love. There's the non-duality right there, and the thing you got to remember, he was accused of being a heretic. You'd think the institutional church is bad today. Imagine what it was like 600 years ago.
Right.
So again, back to the courage that he would be willing to make that kind of statement in a world where he could have been burned at the stake.
Well, my understanding was that they were about to.
Well, he was formally condemned after he died. And of course he defended himself. And there's some scholars who think, the Pope waited till after he died because the Pope knew that there was really there were no legs to stand on in condemning him. He was being condemned because he had enemies. He wasn't being condemned because he was truly deviating from the heart of Christian teaching. But again, that once you have an institution, you have politics. And Eckhart and Marguerite de Peretti. I mean, there are a number of other mystics who have suffered because of the institution. And then what's ironic is 200 years later, you have a John of the Cross come along and basically say the same thing as Meister Eckhart, and he's a saint and a doctor of the church. A different century, different culture. He does, and he had his enemies too, but they weren't able to to attack him to the degree that Eckhart's enemies attacked him.
One of my favorite sermons is when he talks about, Virgin Mary giving birth to Christ, and how it sort of represents our own enlightenment.
And we are all called to be the Blessed Mother. We are all called to give birth to Christ. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean, I'm biologically male. That doesn't mean I'm going to suddenly get pregnant. That means that I'm going to give birth to love. I'm going to give birth to mercy and to forgiveness.
We're back to the kingdom of heaven is within you.
Exactly. It's within, but then it's among us, because what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to give it away. I mean, that's the beauty of it. There's this wonderful guy. He used to live in Asheville. I don't know if he's still up there or not. Named Charles Eisenstein. He's written a number of books. The one I'm familiar with is called "The More Beautiful World We Know Is Possible." And his whole focus is on, he'd be a great guest for your show. His whole focus is on moving kind of our economy away from, kind of the commercial basis where everything has a price tag, and we measure wealth by how much you've accumulated, to what he calls the gift economy, where literally wealth is measured by how generous you are. Mm. If you want to be a millionaire, you just need to be generous to the millionth degree. And obviously we can only be generous with what we have access to. Some people have access to more resources than others. But when we live in a true gift economy, then this idea of having a lot of money in the bank suddenly becomes meaningless, because we're just all held aloft by the web of generosity. That's what is possible. Human beings have everything in their heart to make that happen now. But the problem is we live in, what was it that Dorothy Day said? This dirty, stinking, rotten system, the system that we've created. And Christianity has its share of blame, but also capitalism and just other forces within our culture and the world, culture of the world at large. So, so we live in this culture where we're taught to fear, where we're taught to be afraid of one another, where we're taught to hoard, because if we don't hoard, we're going to end up living on the street, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what does that do? Then the problem just becomes self-fulfilling, and and that's what's at the root of so much of our political hostility and animosity as well, because we don't have this basic idea that we all learned when we were 5 years old, that it's better to share. It's really that simple. Was that book that it was written by a rabbi? Everything I needed to know I learned in kindergarten. There it is. The children are natural mystics. We kind of socialize it out of them.
We take it right out of them. Yes, we do. Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned Judaism real quick. One half of my family, one side is Jewish, mm-hmm. and I have this uncle that, he's all into it. He's always led the Passover dinners and everything. Mm-hmm. And I ran into him just a few weeks ago. He listened to an episode of the podcast where I had Rabbi Rami Shapiro on. Great episode.
I love him. Yeah.
Oh, you know him? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he listened to it because he saw a rabbi, right?
Yeah.
But we're talking about mysticism. And so my uncle asked me, he's like, so, all right. He's like, you don't claim to be Jewish anymore. You don't claim this. He's like, so you're just into mysticism, right? I'm like, yeah. He's like, there's a lot of mysticism in Judaism. I'm like, yes, there is. And I wish somebody showed me that when I was 13.
Yeah. Oh, I know.
I wish I could have learned Kabbalah back when I was 16 years old instead of discovering it late into my 30s.
Yeah. Having that, through Madonna or somebody like that, because that's, we can talk about how the institution distorts the mystical, but the marketplace distorts the mystical too. They're different distortions, and so this is the challenge that we all have. And if we could find this way for the institution to see itself as a custodian of the mysteries, rather than as just this kind of moral watchdog. Hey, I'm all for morality. The world is better when we don't go running around killing each other. Marriage functions better. I mean, we can talk about polyamory, but generally speaking, marriage functions better when people are faithful, when they're not lying and cheating one another. So basic morality makes sense. It's common sense. But the problem is that institutional Christianity, and I think maybe, you see this in other religions too, has become so focused on moralism that it's lost the mystical. And again, this is back to putting the head in front of the heart instead of the other way around, because it's the head that's sitting there saying, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, blah, blah, blah. These are the rules. And if you break the rules, you got to be punished. And the heart is like, let's build a world where nobody wants to steal. Let's build a world where even the thought of violence would make you vomit. We can do that. It's in our DNA, but the heart has to lead. And so you're right. I'm sorry you had that experience. I had the experience too. I mean, I was 18 years old when I read Evelyn Underhill's book on mysticism, which a Unitarian friend gave to me. It's like I had to step outside of Orthodox Christianity to be initiated into Orthodox Christian mysticism. Isn't that ironic? You hear stories. I know this Episcopal priest who spent 2 months in a Tibetan Buddhist monastery. Mm. And at the end of the 2 months, he was ready to resign being an Episcopal priest and just study Buddhism. And he told the Roshi there, it wasn't a Roshi, it was Tibetan, not Zen, the Tulku. He told the Tulku there, I have to quit my job. I can't go back to being an Episcopal priest anymore. I've got to be your student. And the Tulku said, you are not my student, you are my brother priest. Mm. Your job is to go and find what you've learned here, find it in Christianity, because it's there. And it's just, you haven't been taught it. And this man had an MDiv degree. He'd been to seminary, all that, and I do a lot of work with seminaries. The seminaries are getting better, but boy, they still have a long way to go.
Well, it's an interesting comment because in my studies, whether it be Zen, Tibetan Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, they all have a great respect for Jesus.
Of course. And for the great mystics too. I mean, it's like you mentioning Eckhart, I mean, I knew a Santorian priest who loved John of the Cross. When you get to this level of mystical attainment, the divisions just fall away and you truly become a citizen of the world. Mm-hmm. And so you see this, I have a friend who's a Zen poet. She'd be another great guest for your podcast, who just absolutely adores Thomas Merton and the Cloud of Unknowing. Mm. And I'm like, Ando, they're not Zen. She's like, I know they're Christian, but they're enlightened,
That's
right. What I don't care about the institutional stuff. I want the juice of the Enlightenment.
That's right.
I'm like, yeah, well, that's the same reason why I'm reading, I read Pema Chodron, or Thich Nhat Hanh, or, folks like that, because I'm looking for that juice of enlightenment.
That's right.
So,
How would you explain contemplative prayer and how does it help the seeker?
Let me start with the institution. Because believe it or not, the Catholic Church, its catechism actually has a pretty good definition of contemplation. I was surprised when I read it, but really very good. It says contemplation is a prayer of wordless adoration to Christ. Now, again, we're talking in a Christian context. So if you're not a Christian, you might not see it in terms of Christ, but in a Christian context. But this idea of wordless adoration, wordless, giving the mind a break, adoration, letting the heart do the heavy lifting. So you're stepping into silence. You're letting thoughts come and go. You don't fight the thoughts because it's the brain, it's like the heart. It's the nature of the heart to beat. You want your heart to beat. A beating heart is good. Same thing with the brain. It is, I'm talking about the physical, the piece of gray matter inside your skull. Its function is to generate thought. So it's not like you're trying to make the thoughts go away, but you have this gesture of non-attachment. Thoughts come and they go. Thomas Keating, one of the great contemplative teachers of our time, Trappist monk, died just a few years ago. He said that, our thoughts are like boats on a river. We're focusing on the river. That's the silence. And a boat comes by, and another boat comes by, and maybe 3 or 4 boats come by. You let them go. The trick is not to hop on the boat. And that's when you get caught up in your thoughts,
Yeah.
It happens. It happens to us all. But the gesture of contemplation is this gesture of really foregrounding my attentiveness on the silence, so that in the silence, the interior silence, exterior silence is a good thing. You go to monasteries and they're blissfully quiet. But, talk to any monk and he'll tell you, oh yeah, I came here because it was silent. And the first thing I discovered was how noisy I was on the inside. So it's like external silence is there to support us in our quest to find interior silence. And the interior silence is always there. It's beneath all the boats. The river is beneath the boats. So it's, the prayer, the gesture of prayer is this gesture of just allowing thoughts to come and go and learning to rest my attention in the silence between and beneath all the thoughts. Keating says silence is God's first language. You mentioned Rami Shapiro. He's changed his website, but for years he had this great quote on his website. And it was talking about being a rabbi and yet being inner spiritual. And he said, every religion is like a language. And every language has its own strengths and its own weaknesses. There's some things you can say better in one language than another. And he says, Judaism, that's my mother tongue. So naturally, that's the language I speak best. But I'm really interested in learning all these other languages. And then he says, but the ultimate language of the soul is silence. Silence is God's first language. Silence is the soul's first language.
Yeah.
So all contemplative prayer is, it's a Christian form of meditation, but it's a prayerful meditation. It's not just awareness. It is awareness, but also with the recognition that we are immersed in divine love, and that when we are attentive to the silence, that makes us more available to that love that literally can transform and heal everything.
Well, Christian contemplation reminds me of the Eastern tradition of witnessing the mind or self-inquiry.
So like a vipassana, is that what you're speaking
Yeah,
of?
self-inquiry, like who's aware? You're kind of breaking the thought up by asking who's aware or who am I?
And here's the interesting thing is that the story is the eye with which I see God is the eye with which God sees me. So in my awareness, I'm gazing into the eyes of God. But when we move into the silence, we're not telling the story. If you start thinking about the story, you're on the boat again. So it's this interesting paradox that what I like to say is that the story of mysticism is like a setting that holds a diamond. You buy a diamond and what do? You put it in a ring because otherwise you lose the diamond. So the setting is the story, the sacred story. The story that the eye with which I see God is the eye with which God sees me. Silence is God's first language. But when you actually step into the prayer practice, then you're no longer on the setting, you're actually on the jewel or in the jewel, and you're in pure silence. And frankly, I'm sure if you've studied meditation practices from different traditions, silence is silence is silence is silence.
Mm-hmm.
You enter into silence. I don't care if you're sitting in a zendo or if you're sitting in a Hindu temple, an ashram, or an Orthodox monastery or a Catholic monastery, or out in the woods. We're storytellers. So we all have stories. We have the Christian story and the Jewish story and the Muslim story and, so forth and so on. There's nothing wrong with having those stories. Do the stories help you to access the silence? If they do, they're good stories. If they don't, then maybe you need a different story or maybe at least a different emphasis in your story. Mm-hmm. And then, back to the Rami Shapiro thing. And it's okay to have one main story, but learn from some of the other stories too. Because there are some things those stories will tell you that your own story may not be able to tell you quite as well.
One of the other things you're into is Celtic wisdom or Celtic wisdom, depending on who you ask.
Yeah, if it's a basketball team, it's Celtic.
Yeah.
If it's the wisdom tradition, it's Celtic. So
Celtic, yeah.
yeah.
So where does that fall into everything?
Well, it's really a subcategory of the mystical tradition, because certainly the early Celts, they were very much mystics. If you look at the Christian tradition, you've got the New Testament period. Okay, so you've got Jesus, the prime wisdom teacher. Then you've got the New Testament, the community that develops around him. Then after several generations, what you begin to see are men and women who actually abandon the cities in the Roman Empire and go live in the desert. We call them the desert mothers and fathers. And they really are kind of the first mystics that we have documented evidence of. I mean, there were a few people before them, but especially in the 3rd century, you've got these amazing desert teachers. The Celts, again, we're talking about the other end of Europe. We're talking about Ireland, Scotland, Wales, those places. They are following the desert mothers and fathers. So their tradition is built on, well, it's kind of a hybrid, because it's built on their indigenous tradition, for lack of a better word, the Druids, of course, within a Christian framework. So they're Christian. They're followers of Jesus, but they've still got that kind of druidical, nature mysticism and profound, love for the natural order. But then they've also got this contemplative wisdom coming from the deserts. And it's like, so you bring those two together and you have what is just the flowering of spirituality in the Celtic world. I love the Celtic tradition for a couple of reasons. Number one, McColman is a Scottish name, so it's just in my blood. That's my DNA.
Right.
But also, you and I have talked a lot about how mysticism at its best is an embodied tradition. It's a heart-centered tradition. And we've also both acknowledged that Christianity, too often loses sight of that. It gets stuck in its head. It gets stuck in kind of abstractions. I find that the earthiness of the Celts, because of their kind of pagan foundation, that what Celtic spirituality represents to me is like this integral marriage of the pagan and the Christian that then becomes its own unique, beautiful expression. And I think we need that in today's world. And that, so for me, I just find the Celts, they help me to stay grounded. They remind me that, that my love for the Jesus tradition isn't about just kind of floating off into outer space, but it's always about remaining just in my body, here on the earth, finding that light, that luminous, that divine presence, that kingdom within, just right here and right now. Plus, they're great storytellers, and boy, do they make good beer and whiskey. So,
Isn't the Celtic wisdom somewhat connected to another great Christian mystic by the name of St. Patrick?
Well, yeah, Patrick is very much in that tradition. He is, to be honest with you, he wouldn't be the first one I would think of. There was a fellow named John Scotus Erigena, and then John Duns or just he's known as Duns Scotus. They were both a little bit later than Patrick. We don't have a lot of literature on Patrick. The tradition is very narrow. We have more folklore, chasing the snakes out of Ireland. If you really want, like talking about Meister Eckhart earlier, if you want that kind of philosophical mysticism, there's some figures that come a little bit later in the tradition that are more interesting to sink your teeth into. Patrick belongs to the storytelling tradition, the oral tradition. Most of what we have are stories. And I find much more compelling than him. And again, this is not a put down on Patrick, but it's just to really elevate this person is Bridget of Kildare. That in her stories, we really find, again, that embodiment of the integration of the pagan and the Christian, the, just this deep spirituality of love, of compassion for the poor, of peacemaking, reconciliation, bringing people together. She just was really this amazing figure. And some scholars have speculated that she was actually a pagan priestess who, for whatever reason, decided to become a Jesus follower. And so again, there's that marriage of the earth-centered and then the Christian, the Jewish kind of mystical Greco-Jewish, because Christian mysticism really represents the meeting of the Jewish and the Greek traditions. And then the Celtic brings that third, that kind of, Irish, Scottish to bear as well. And I just find bringing those three together is just a really creative place to be.
I read that you had a life-changing encounter with God as a teenager. What happened?
I was at a youth camp. I grew up in the Lutheran church, so I was just at a Lutheran youth camp. Was not a particularly pious kid, I was there more, to flirt with the girls than to necessarily talk about Jesus. But, I was there, 16 years old. During this Saturday night Holy Communion service, I just moved into this really profound kind of encounter with the divine presence. The room began to glow. It was like people had brought in a bunch of lights. I don't have them turned on right now, but if you saw my office, I've got lights all around my office because I film video here, and so I've got all these lights shining on me. And when all those lights are on, it's really bright in here. It was like that, only without physical lights. There was kind of like this spiritual luminosity. The sense of love coursing through me, just in my veins, in my bones, was just so profound. So just this incredible sense of light and love, and time stood still. I look back at it, and rationally, this probably lasted a minute or two, but it felt like eternity. It felt like I just popped out of time.
Yeah.
And there's this wonderful verse in Ecclesiastes, the Jewish Bible, the Christian Old Testament, that God has put eternity in our hearts. In fact, my new book that's coming out next summer is called Eternal Heart, and it's based on that verse. And this idea, so that our hearts can access eternity. We can pop out of linear time, and that's what happened to me that day. I popped out of linear time. I just sank into eternity, just had this incredible, blissful encounter with love and light, and then popped right back in. And maybe a minute or two had gone by, but it felt like it could have been hours or, whatever.
Right.
And when it was over, I actually asked, or I didn't ask, I went up to some people and I said, wasn't that just the most amazing thing? And they all looked at me and they're like, it was nice. Do you want to go grab a Coke or something? And I was 16 years old. It's like, I didn't have it in my computer that I could have an interior experience that would just be mine, a gift from me alone. Mm. I really was operating under this assumption that something objectively miraculous had just happened. Well, it did, but it was in my heart, It felt like it was in my eyes and in my hands, but it was in my heart. Mm-hmm. I actually, after that, they had a dance, and I'm a shy kid to begin with, so there is that. But I went back to the room. I couldn't just sit there and dance. This was 1977. It was, the Bee Gees and that kind of, not my thing, I had to go back and be silent, be alone, be in stillness. It's like I basically became a monk that night. Now, not literal. I mean, I'm married, I don't live in a monastery, but I gave birth to the monk archetype in me in response to that, to what happened.
I've had similar experience, and
most people do, but we don't know how to talk about it.
In the tradition of Zen, this would be called a satori.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Mm-hmm.
And it's been described as an invitation. Mm-hmm. It's an invitation to something more. And how fortunate are you to have had that at 16?
And I'll tell you, for years, I tried to replicate it. And I
you can't chase it. You can't chase it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I didn't have a mentor. I didn't have I told my pastor about it, and he thought something weird had happened, and it's like, well, I have to be careful. They're going to put me on meds, Right. But it's like, right. And it wasn't until probably I started working with the Trappists, and I was 44 when I started working with the Trappists. This is 16. So it's like, 28 years later.
Now, before you continue, can you explain what the Trappist monks are?
Okay, so they're monks in the Catholic tradition, in the Christian world. It's an order of monks. There are Benedictines, there are Carthusians, there are these different orders of monks. So the Trappists, and Trappist is a nickname. Their official name is the Cistercians of the Strict Observance, which is a mouthful, so they just go by Trappist. Several of the people we've mentioned are Trappist. Thomas Merton was a Trappist. Thomas Keating was a Trappist. Basil Pennington. So the Trappists have done a pretty good job in really trying to be at the forefront of reclaiming the contemplative Christian tradition. And so that's one of the reasons why I just feel tremendously privileged to have studied with the Trappists. I actually made my profession as a lay Cistercian. So, so I'm under a spiritual relationship with them as well. What I came to realize, I don't have those kinds of peak experiences anymore because I live it.
Mm.
That light and that love is just, it's always available to me.
Mm.
And I say that in all humility because it's always available to you too, and to all of us. There's, Charlotte Joko Beck, her book about Zen, nothing special, and it's such a delicious pun, isn't it? Nothing special. There's nothing special about being any of this. Even nothingness is special in this world.
No
it's
thing.
Just, yeah.
No thingness.
Yeah. For many years, I chased after silence. And then I realized I am silence.
Mm.
And I'm like, that's it. That's it right there.
That's it, man. Carl, where can people come find you and say hello?
Well, I do have a presence online. The easiest thing is my website, and it's just my name. So I'll spell it CarlMcColman, carlmccolman.com.
Carl, it's been a real pleasure. There's a lot of gems in this recording.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to have the conversation as well.
If you'd like to support this podcast, now I'd like to invite you to my exclusive Patreon page to help support my work and this podcast. Of course, I'll hit you with tons of bonus material and behind the scenes news if you become a member. You can also explore my work. All you have to do is hit the link in the description. So I hope to see you there, and I'll talk to you on the next episode.
Thanks for listening to Inner Peace with Dr. Reese. If this episode opened your heart, feel free to share on social media and tell your loved ones. Also, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next time, may peace be with you.